Hi, I'm Cheryl Belson with American Sewing Guild, and I am so happy to be joined for this episode of Fireside Chats by the Editorial Director of Threads magazine, Sarah McFarland. And Sarah's role as editor gives her a unique opportunity to combine her love of journalism with her excitement for creating clothes and accessories. She says she loves discovering, learning, and sharing the techniques readers need to accomplish the sewing project of their dreams. Threads magazine describes itself simply as the magazine for people who love to sew, and I know how much it's inspired me personally, as well as so many other ASG members over the years. So Sarah, I am really looking forward to hearing more about your journey into the world of sewing and the world of journalism. So welcome, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, Cheryl, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk about Threads. I love talking about Threads. I love my job, and I love ASG. It's one of my favorite conferences. I'm so sorry we didn't get to all get together last year, but I'm looking forward to the next conference, definitely. So Thank you very much for having me.
Yes, you're welcome. Well, I understand that you've actually been preoccupied with crafts since you were a child. So I'd love to hear you talk about that a little bit. And I'm curious, was there a person in your life that fueled that love?
Oh, yes. I have been fascinated by fiber art since I was a small child. And I yarn, crewel work, embroidery, crochet, knitting. I learned all of these skills at a pretty early age. And my mother helped me with many of them. My mother definitely got me started on crewel embroidery. I have to say, to this day, my mom is better at crewel than I am, because crewel is like painting with wool, and it takes a really gentle, artistic, looser touch. And I'm way too precise with it. I want to do like precise embroidery. She also taught me to knit. And then something that I think was interesting is she did sew, but I got a lot of my love of sewing and my interest in sewing from my father. Both my parents are educators, and my father was in math and science education. So he knew math and science, and he taught math and science teachers from kindergarten through high school level teacher. So he had a broad knowledge of science, and he liked to learn new skills. And at one point, I think I was about 6 or 7 years old, he told my mom that he wanted to learn how to sew, and he made me beautiful garments. I don't have any to this day, but I definitely remember them, with lovely ruffles and trims and all kinds of things. And he really pushed himself to learn that skill. He also really got good at gourmet cooking.
It's so interesting because we are focusing more in these days on men who sew, and there's a lot of men out there that sew. So it's interesting that even back in your youth, you were exposed to that.
Yes. And, it's interesting to me, too, that when I was an early sewer, I really didn't know what I didn't know. And some of my first projects, I look back now and I cannot believe that I achieved them, but I used to like to sew men's shirts. I think I could sew shirts for myself, and I also like to sew shirts for my father, sort of in return for the garments that he had made for me. And I think I was able to have decent success because of the nature of shirting fabrics. So wonderful to press, and you can cut them very precisely.
That seems to fit in with what you just said about how your mother is more artistic and you're more precise, and shirt making is definitely a precise thing to do.
Yes. My mother was an art teacher for a time, and she was a reading specialist. So it's funny because she started to teach me to knit, and then I really picked up knitting from a wonderful book. It's no longer in print, but you can still find it sometimes with a library binding. I think a lot of libraries had this book, but it was called The Workshop Book of Knitting by Ursula von Wartburg. And I always love to promote great tutorial magazines and books, even beyond Threads. And that is a classic. And it can take a child all the way from, starter knitting through classic Aran cable designs. Beautiful book.
Interesting. I'm sure some of our viewers are going to go look that book up.
Yeah. Actually, the knitting actually really connected me to threads early on before I even realized it. Because until the 90s, the magazine covered all kinds of fabric or fiber arts. And then we moved into garment sewing focus. And that was because the market had changed. And I have to tell you, if you go back and look at early customer responses to the magazine, there was the knitting side that said, please have more knitting, and the sewing side that said, please have more sewing. So at one point, they chose a side. But I used to go to the library as a young girl and get out the threads compilations on knitting techniques. And what I discovered about threads right away is something that is core to our mission to this day. And that is threads teaches techniques. It's not really a project-focused magazine. We want to teach you to fish so that you can create the garments that you want to make.
Yeah, that's very evident in your magazine. As a matter of fact, I actually wore this today because I learned this collar technique in one of the Threads magazine issues.
Yes.
I have done many of these, and then I got kind of courageous, I guess you'd say, and I tried some other things where instead of doing this, I did piping and some. So it's I've learned some techniques myself through reading your magazine. So
if I remember that technique correctly, it's a decorative element as well as a problem solver. It sort of gives you a nice edge on the collar.
it does. You are right. Well, somewhere along the way, journalism entered the scene. And so I would love to hear you talk about some of the experiences that opened up the door to that passion in your life and ultimately brought you to your current position at Threads.
Oh, absolutely. Thanks. I graduated from a college. I went to an all-girls school, Wells College in upstate New York. It's now co-ed, but it was a wonderful liberal arts education and a very small school. I graduated with a liberal arts degree and had no idea what to do with it. And I remember I answered a classified ad in the local newspaper for a news assistant because I was very curious. I did like to write, and this particular job, it didn't pay much at all, but you kept track of the local community calendar of events. So I was in contact with musicians, art galleries, local movie theaters. Anybody who was hosting an event contacted me, and I would do write-ups or put it into the community calendar. So I got to know a lot of people that way and really become involved in the community. And that was the Elmira Star-Gazette. It's still in business today, and it's the first Gannett newspaper out of the Gannett newspaper chain. So I was very proud to work there, and I worked there for almost 10 years, news assistant, then a reporter, copy editor, and then eventually features editor. And my last position there, this is really interesting to me because it led right to Threads, was as publications editor. More newspapers were developing magazine inserts. So I no longer worked on the daily newspaper. I worked on weekly, monthly, and annual inserts. And I learned about there's a big difference between the photography in a magazine and the photography in a newspaper, and just learning about layout and design and the feel of a magazine. And I had always secretly wanted to work at a magazine. I love the experience of reading a magazine and the thought and work that goes into planning what you're going to present there. It's like every spread is this opportunity to show something artistic and, in the case of Threads, very informative on topics that I really personally enjoy.
You had no idea where that was going to go when you started out that first job, did you?
No, I didn't. And in 2008, there was a recession, and many newspapers, including the newspaper that I worked at, downsized. And so I was laid off at that time. And I was very involved in the community. I was a member of many clubs and organizations from my years of being connected and reporting on things in the newspaper. But I could not find another job in the area. I had a lot of colleagues who were laid off at the same time, and we were competing with each other for, just very few positions. And a good friend of mine, who was an avid Threads reader, pointed out a job listing that she found online. I didn't come across it myself. I owe my job here to a friend of mine forwarding it to me. And I remembered reading the Threads knitting books. Right. And, then I researched the magazine and I thought, I had a good feeling about it. I thought I might be a good fit for this role. And I remember writing my cover letter and being really nervous about, well, of course, if it's a job you're really interested in, you want to make a good impression in the cover letter. But I tried to just be very natural in it. And I gave a couple anecdotes of photo shoots that I had to deal with at the newspaper. And it's very funny when you get a veteran crime reporter to photograph dogs and balloons for some kind of, I can't remember, it was like annual pet celebration day. That was the kind of thing, as publications editor, I had to get these veteran journalists to take a more lighthearted approach. I did get the job at Threads, and it was wonderful because, not only because it was a dream job, but I had a very demoralizing year of being laid off. Had never experienced not having a job. So, I was in a very rural area, and I got this job that was really a dream job. And one of the first things I was able to do at Threads was to go to New York City, which I had only been to New York City previously on school or pleasure trips. I had never traveled there by myself, went to New York City and interviewed Koos van den Akker in his studio. And he was, an idol of mine. I loved his designs. He was just lovely and welcoming. I got to see his working studio. And I remember leaving his studio and stopping in a Starbucks and just thinking, how did this happen? How did my life change so quickly and work out this way? I've just come away from an interview with one of my idols in New York City after not having a job for a year. So if that is at all inspiring or comforting to anyone, I couldn't believe things changed around like that for me.
What a great story, both on the level of getting to spend time with him, as well as on the level of just the encouragement that so many people might need right now coming out of this time of pandemic and so much loss and everything. So that is a great story.
I just feel so privileged to have had this opportunity, starting then, and to talk to people like that. And there have been so many other artists and skilled instructors over the years, just too many to count. Oh my gosh, Claire Schaefer. I remember meeting her for the first time. She's so lovely and gracious and so knowledgeable. And all of our contributing editors are just wonderful. There's Louise Cutting and Susan Kalji and Kenneth D. King. The list of people that we get to work with at Threads is amazing. I'm humbled all the time.
You have such an opportunity to meet and work with so many incredible creative people in the sewing community. So my own personal experience, even trying to look to research people to do these fireside chats with, there's so many people out on the landscape in social media and whatnot. And it's hard to even keep up with who the new and emerging people are. So how do you do that, as well as you have to nurture relationships with long-standing leaders in the field? So talk about that a little bit.
Cheryl, I want to be honest. That is an area where I feel we could do better. I really do. And I think that it is something that has changed in recent years. For a long time, We relied on a network of people that we had worked with. And now, with exposure on social media, we are able to seek out and find just an amazing new array of talented people. It takes a little time, though. And we can talk more about this a little later. The demands on the editorial staff have changed in recent years. And I would say we're at a time of transition and a time of trying to find balance. But I would like to expand. I would like to appeal to a more diverse cast of contributors, while definitely keeping all of our contacts and still satisfying our core audience. Mm-hmm. It's a challenge. But it's one that we definitely perceive and are working on.
And so you've sparked my curiosity here again. So how are you working on that? That is something that the American Sewing Guild also has a heart for. And I'm curious, how are you working on that?
We are trying to make contacts through the various sewing communities. We do searches on Instagram. When we find someone that we think can open up a new audience to us, we're constantly asking, who do you know? Who do you think is talented? And sort of trying to branch out from there. I think for a long time, we looked for some sign of established writing skill or a past history of teaching. And I'm very open to looking past that or helping new content creators develop that with us. Okay. Threads has very high standards for accuracy. And I think that, and we have a definite process and things that we look to, like consistency of terms. If you call something a binding at one stage in the story, are you using the same term throughout? That kind of thing. And we can help anyone develop those skills to accurately express the techniques they want to teach.
So it sounds like you're just keeping your eye on the landscape, you're asking questions, and you're opening up to developing new areas of talent. Maybe there's sewing talent already evident, but you're helping develop the content creation talent of these people when it's needed.
Yes. And I think that goes back to just the fundamental principles of Threads. When Threads first started, it's before social media. It was before sort of fiber artists were able to express themselves necessarily directly to their audience. And Threads would go out, discover these people, photograph, tell their stories. And often the editors, it's our purpose to help the artist, help the sewist tell their story, share their technique. And our sole goal is to make sure the communication is clear between artists and the audience.
Interesting. Speaking of the audience, I hadn't thought of this until just now, but if you had to say in just a brief sentence, I guess, who do you consider your audience for the magazine Threads?
I would say, that's a tough one. It's funny. Through the years, sometimes I like to look at the marketing path that the magazine has taken in the past. And this was funny to me. There was a time in the past where there were different personas that were given names. Like Debbie likes to do this kind of sewing, and Roseanne is into quilting, that kind of thing. We don't do that anymore. I would say, just absolutely core principle, I would say that the Thread sewist is discerning, and it is a person. Like if it was a friend of mine, she'd be challenging. She would say, "Why did you do that way? What about this way? Is this a better way?" She's going to question what I tell her. So I want to make sure I don't waste your time and that I explain things clearly. And right now, our readership is very much predominantly female, but that's something that we want to change. That's one of those areas of diversity expansion that we're going into. So we've started covering more men's garments and pattern review, and we've started bringing in more male authors, and we want to show techniques on more male garments too. We have a great story coming up on altering men's ready-to-wear shirts.
Oh,
So, yeah, it's
good. Very good. Well, let's springboard from this, because it sounds like it's a good time to do it, to the Threads Ambassador Program. That's a program that really has interested me quite a bit, and I'm curious if you could talk about the objectives of this program. I'm guessing it might tie into some of the things you've already talked about a little bit. And how do you develop those ambassador relationships?
Oh, thank you for asking about that. We started the Digital Ambassador Program in 2018, and it has a number of purposes. One thing was we wanted to find people that consistently wrote or posted on their social media about interesting aspects of sewing that maybe we weren't able to cover in the magazine on a regular basis. So right now we've got Pamela Howard, Becky Fulgoni, Marcy Harrell, and we have a new digital ambassador coming, Gilbert Muniz. And they're all very talented in different aspects of sewing. So Pamela Howard is an amazing alterations expert. Becky used to run the Passion for Fashion Challenge at Novi. And so she was sort of the Tim Gunn of the challenge. And she is so creative. And she does a lot with recycling fabrics, making, napkins or table linens into beautiful blouses. She does really impeccable creative work. Marcy is so colorful and fashionable and brings such vibrancy and excitement to sewing. So I always love to see what she creates. And Gilbert, love Gilbert. I met him at an ASG show years ago, and he's written several articles for Threads, and he can do just about everything. I would say he excels at embellishments and just very detailed techniques. But, as I said, he can really do anything. So we've got consistent flow of content from these 4 very talented people. And I should mention, until just recently, we had another digital ambassador. It was Peter Lappin, and Male Pattern Boldness. And we loved working with Peter, and he's gone on to pursue some different projects. But all of his content is still available on the website too. And of course, Peter talked a lot about vintage sewing, finding and maintaining vintage sewing machines, vintage patterns, and he did a lot of menswear sewing for himself. So what's nice about the web content is it's not as labor intensive as the print content for these authors. The standards for the photography are not as great. The photography we do for the magazine is actually taken at very, very high resolution. Individual photo files in the original TIFF format are sometimes 50 megabytes.
Wow.
Yeah, they're very, very large to have the sufficient resolution for print in a magazine. On the other hand, you could take very nice web post photos at home with an iPhone or with a good digital camera. So instead of working months in advance to put everything together for a print story, with the digital ambassadors, we're able to have a new piece from each of them each month and really showcase this evolving continual library of content from them.
And that's a great way to get to know people on a little deeper level, because you're seeing those people cycle through more frequently.
Yes. I should mention a lot of the digital ambassador content is part of our Insider Digital membership. And it is a 4-pay membership. It can be bundled with the print subscription. But content costs money to create. So we can't offer all of it for free, but having all of that continual content from the digital ambassadors, I think is a great value for our insiders. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to set up the program, so that you would continually get new content as an insider.
Well, speaking of content, you also do a podcast, and it's a podcast that's also offered up as a video. So you kind of have your choice of how to receive the content. So maybe you can talk a little bit about how that got started.
Oh, sure. We also started Sewing with Threads, our monthly podcast, in 2018. And that was, again, we wanted to stay in contact and share the talents of these wonderful sewists. And it was a way to do it in a different manner, in a conversation. And also have wonderful new videos for our YouTube channel. So we tape the episodes during quarantine. It's all been remote. And I think our furthest flung guest was Liesl Gibson, and she's in Spain. And I think you've talked to Jenny Rushmore too. We talked to Jenny. Mm-hmm. And back when we were in the offices in Newtown, Connecticut, we would be able to have guests from New York City come in. And we loved to do the in-person chats. We would have Kenneth King, Peter Lappin came, Gail Yellen is in Connecticut, so Gail came to see us, and Pamela Leggett. It would be very difficult to pick a favorite. We have learned something different from every guest that we've had on the show. I think one of my favorite episodes was a little bit off sewing, but it was somebody who really inspired me, and I think many sewists would find inspiration from her content, and that was Doris Raymond. She is a vintage she has a vintage clothing store in Los Angeles, The Way We Wore, and I had seen her on a Smithsonian show before, and so it was a real celebrity experience for me to talk to her, and she was wonderful. And I think I got one of the best comments that I've ever gotten on the podcast. And someone wrote in and said, thank you for introducing me to her. You changed my life for the better. I was like, oh my gosh, that is the goal when you're creating content. Absolutely. I think another favorite moment was when we were talking to Marcy Harrell, and Marcy mentioned why she doesn't save fancy fabrics anymore.
Well, let's pause right here and show our viewers that right now.
If you sew it, the event will come. I don't look for an event and think I have to sew something fancy for that. I sew the fancy thing first in anticipation of the event that will happen.
That was a fantastic clip. Thanks for sharing that with us.
We love doing the podcast. We frequently hear requests to make it more frequent, and we're working on that.
I totally understand. It's more work than viewers understand is involved in doing something like this, to do interviews. It's great fun, but it's a lot of work.
It is fun. I almost wish I could schedule them all in a week and just continually do this. It's tough to schedule it around other work and sort of switch gears like that, but it's a lot of fun.
Yeah. Well, and it's important to keep things fun because sometimes work isn't fun. And speaking of not fun, it's not fun that so many paper magazines have fallen by the wayside in recent years. And we've lost a number of sewing magazines. And even in American Sewing Guild, we had to abandon the paper version of our communication. But Threads is still standing in both paper, and we've talked a lot about the digital form. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on how Threads balances between the print and the digital world, how you strike that balance.
Well, thank you for asking about that. It's something that we take very, very seriously. And there are comments from our audience frequently about, not wanting Threads to go digital. That is not our intent. My intent is to find a balance between print and digital. The challenge is it's very expensive to print a magazine. There are shipping and transportation costs. The cost of the paper continues to rise. And recently we went to quarterly issues, and that was to balance the rising costs versus the subscription, the amount that we take in for subscriptions. And there was many people were upset about that, and there was some confusion. I can even say it here: if you signed up for a 6-issue subscription, you will still continue to receive 6 issues. It will just be over a longer period of time. We're not gypping anyone of their issues, no. And another thing is Threads is a particularly expensive magazine to print because we insist on a certain quality of paper. And the reason for that is we want to have the perfect bound spine. So each issue of Threads doesn't have a staple in the edge. When you look at your issues, you're able to read the features there on the spine. The cover paper quality is a little thicker and more excellent, so it feels nice in your hands. And the pages are not at all transparent. I've recently seen some publications go to very thin, transparent pages, and you can see a photo on the other page. And you can imagine trying to follow a technique in Threads and seeing bleed through on the pages. It would not be good. No, we want to keep the print magazine, but hopefully increase revenue with the digital membership, so that the digital membership begins to support the print publication, so that we can keep that going. Yeah. So we have to divert a certain amount of resources to making the digital membership valuable. I think it's just going to be the reality going forward for publications, I'm sure.
Yeah, makes total sense. So, yeah. Well, Sarah, I always like to close these chats asking about what's coming up next. So is there a new thing that we can be watching for on the horizon from Sarah McFarland and Threads Magazine?
Okay. Yes, we have many wonderful projects on the way. One thing is we're working on a reorganization of content on our website. So we're developing project guides. They aren't necessarily particularly projects. They are guides to different aspects of sewing where information is collected conveniently for our audience. I understand our website is a bit scattershot, and it was not organized as I had imagined it would be. And this project guide plan will help reorganize the content into ways the editors believe the audience will enjoy discovering it. So we've been working on one which will be released soon, and it's Learn to Sew. And it is to many people think that Threads is only advanced sewing, and it's not. We have many beginner and basic and just essential techniques for sewers. Now, I think the Learn to Sew guide will be very nice for any sewer who wants to brush up on skills too. So I recommend it for anybody. And it'll be a guide with 5 specific chapters, and you can follow the process through or easily find a technique that you're looking for.
Nice.
And
so does that mean, for example, if I'm looking for something like a collar embellishment, I could search for collar techniques?
Well, it's interesting that you asked about that, because our second project guide, which should come out near the end of August, is Fit and Sew Tops. Now, we went with tops because we wanted to cover possibly knit or woven garments. We didn't want to specify blouses or shirts. But that project guide is going to have chapters on fitting. So it's going to be pattern work, muslin work, shoulders, bust fit. That's going to be covered in initial chapter. And then we have different collar details will be another chapter, embellishments, and then some of our shirt and top projects collected from the magazine and the website. So the project guides are going to be nice. It's going to collect information so you can find things more easily on the site. And the other thing we're investigating is webinars and web courses. And, I know ASG has offered wonderful courses during the pandemic, and it was something that we wanted to, and I just haven't developed that yet because I want them to be really good. But we are in talks with some different talent, and we're also investigating the best platform. And another thing is I really miss the Threads experience. That was our live event in New York City. So we want to return to either a virtual version of the Threads experience or, host it again in New York City. And that's going to take about a year to plan. But
it's like planning the American Sewing Guild conference.
Exactly.
It starts more than a year in advance. It starts more like 2 years in advance from finding the location to lining up all of the events and educators. So it's a big job, but I know personally some people that have gone to the Threads experience and came home raving about it. So I do hope that you achieve that goal.
It was a wonderful event. I loved hosting it. New York City I love supporting the garment district and all the fabric shops there. And it is really a world-class destination to see a variety and see and shop a variety of fabrics. Yeah. And Cheryl, I wanted to take this opportunity to speak a little bit about how anyone listening can write for Threads. I've mentioned these wonderful established people who have careers, but everybody starts somewhere, and Threads is and always has been a reader-written magazine. We have specific guidelines for authors on our website, and I wanted to give some tips if you want to submit a proposal and some advice on how long it takes and why we turn some things down. When you send in a proposal, make it as detailed as you can, and photos are tremendous. I'm afraid it's very difficult for us to go on, I want to try this, or I'm thinking of applying this technique, or I saw someone else do this. That's difficult for us to move on anything like that. So if you can show us, I've done this technique, this is how it turns out, and show us photographs, that's very helpful. We have to reject many of the proposals that come to us, but don't feel down if you get a rejection. There are many, many reasons. And sometimes it's because we've realized we may have something already in the pipeline that is similar, and it's just a coincidence. Maybe it was covered way back when, and the submitter didn't realize that we had already covered that topic. Or it may be on a topic that is close to something we already have planned. Also, there are times when people submit projects. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, we are really a technique magazine. So I sometimes receive proposals that will read something like, this is how I modified this particular dress. And the results are beautiful, but there's not a way to translate that for the general readership audience. And I guess my last piece of advice was, please be patient. We plan issues in sort of in waves, and sometimes the issues are planned out 18 months in advance.
Wow.
So, and another thing that people are sometimes not aware of is that we are working on issues at least 7 months in advance, most of the time. So sometimes it takes us a while to get back to you. We may have already had all the current issues planned out, but we do try to get back to everybody.
Well, that sounds like some really good advice. Well, Sarah, you have shared so much interesting insight and information about yourself and about the magazine Threads. And I absolutely have loved having this chat with you. It's been such a pleasure to hear about your personal journey as well as your work with Threads. So, what a treat it's been to just peek behind the little Thread scenes with you. So thank you so much for spending time with me today.
Well, Cheryl, thank you for the invitation. I love talking about Threads, and it was great speaking with you and getting to share so much information about this job and publication that I love.
Well, until the next time we meet, bye-bye and happy sewing.
Oh, thank you.